Well, good afternoon and welcome to another book review discussion. Today, our very special guests are the esteemed Professors Paul Gavrilyuk and Father Andrew Hofer. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Glad to be.
Today, we are discussing their beautiful new volume just out this last quarter from Oxford, the Oxford Handbook of Deification. So we're going to chat about that. But first of all, just a few quick introductions. Father Andrew, professor of Patristics and Ancient Languages, just so you have two huge portfolios. That's great. At the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. Welcome. And
Thank
Paul
you.
Gavrilyuk, esteemed, world-renowned professor, I say anyways, I don't know about anyone else, but the Aquinas Chair in Theology and Philosophy at University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, which we Canadians consider the best of the states. We quite like Minnesota, so that's great. And so both of you widely published in the field of patristics and deification as well. And so we're very grateful to you both. So again, congratulations on a wonderful volume. It is impressive. It is far more expansive than I expected. It's huge. Last night, my one of my daughters saw it on the bed, and she said, "Oh, did you finish it?" I said, "No, no, I have not finished it." But it is
Well,
beautiful. So
well,
before we
thank
get started, and I do have some questions just about the process of getting this off the ground. And I'm actually particularly keen because we're in the midst of about to publish or to send in a proposal for a handbook for Irenaeus. And so I'm very keen to learn from you both this morning. But first of all, deification. What are we talking about? Help me out with a basic definition here, if you could.
well, we certainly struggled as a group. We struggled precisely with definitional questions because if deification means everything, then we all agreed that it explains nothing. And so historically, deification has been a philosopher's nightmare and an ecumenist's paradise because it's such a stretchable concept. And so, what we tried to do as a group, we tried to come up with a definition, with a working definition of deification that could be used to rule out the sort of the elements of deification, or rather, that could be used as a guideline for what counts as a robust account of deification. And you're right, the volume is pretty heavy, and of course, that's the idea behind the handbooks more generally. If you throw it out of the seminary window, it's supposed to kill at least one graduate student. That's the bar of success. And so it should be taken, therefore, in homeopathic doses. And so the introduction especially would be something that we would probably point the readers to, and then the chapters of interest to the readers. So if you turn to page 5 of the introduction, you will find the following expansive definition of deification. Oh, this is great. This is
There it is
actually
right
great.
there for you.
There it is. And so we decided, our group decided, that deification is a process and goal by which the human being or church or in some way the whole creation comes to participate in God, Christ, divine life, divine attributes, divine energies, divine glory, by growing into the likeness of God while remaining a creature ontologically distinct from the Creator. This process is often also described as divine adoption, regeneration, glorification, sanctification, and union with God. Human deification is made possible by the incarnation of the divine Logos in Jesus Christ and is sustained by the Holy Spirit through the sacramental life of the church, prayer, ascetical discipline, and growth in virtue. Now, we meant every single word here, and we could certainly go a bit in depth on some of the concepts. And maybe Father Andrew, if you'd like to help us maybe unpack a few of these, or again, say more about how we approached the definitional questions.
Thanks, Paul. So yes, we thought that we would be good to identify markers of deification. So what are things that are found when we present deification theologies? First off, we found that there is a variety. So we wanted to respect a variety. And then also to be able to exclude things that could pretend to be a deification, but are outside the bounds of Christian deification. So to give you one indication of something that is important as a marker and that indicates something between Christian and non-Christian deification, while remaining a creature ontologically distinct from the Creator. So that the one deified does not become God in a way where that person loses a creaturely existence. So there's not an annihilation and absorption where only God remains and one's own identity ceases to be. So sometimes people object to deification because they think that that someone becomes a god in a way that loses the creaturely status. We remain creatures. That's a part and parcel of a Christian understanding. And oftentimes then to be able to see that people who articulate deification want to exclude, say, pagan forms of deification. That this is not entering into a pantheon. So that there are all different things at stake, but there would be some things where we want to emphasize that there is a breadth, but within the breadth, also you have exclusion. And don't forget that in Genesis, it was the serpent who was tricking Eve by saying, "Oh, you will be gods, as gods." So that there's something about the first sin that had a possibility of a false deification present.
So I couldn't agree more. This was definitely an emphasis. And what we discovered most recently is that apparently even this claim that we remain ontologically distinct from the Creator is in fact controversial for some Christian theologians today. And so, from Schelling and Hegel to John Milbank and David Bentley Hart, apparently this premise that seems to be pretty fundamental to all patristic theology is not, in fact, self-evident to some contemporary theologians who seem to insist that we, in fact, are ontologically God, and it's just a matter of realizing this very reality. And of course, that would be true about, let's say, the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, but Christian theology, from Irenaeus on, since you mentioned Irenaeus, is pretty insistent on the fact that this distinction remains important. And if you think of the Confession of the Martyrs, what is paradoxical and extraordinary about the Confession of the Martyrs, they're dying for God, who is the true God and who is the Creator, as distinct from false gods. And I'm talking about the early martyrs, early Christian martyrs. And so they're dying, in a sense, for the sake of the God who is the true Creator, as opposed to false deities. And yet, in the very moment of confessing the faith in God as the transcendent Creator, they're also sharing the most intimate union with God. And that's what we were trying to capture also with the notion of deification, this wonderful and beautiful paradox of being in the closest unity with God and yet still maintaining the distinction.
Right. You actually just brought something to mind for me, how you commented that maybe you didn't use the word of a surprise for us, but the perhaps the shocking thought that this distinction needs to be argued so clearly. But it just occurs to me just yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was writing up the little chapter for the proposal on Irenaeus and on the doctrine of God, and was discussing this point and made the comment of how frequently he stresses this. I mean, ad nauseum, over and over and over. And I hadn't thought about it too much, but now that you mention this, he's clearly bringing this up over and over for a reason. So clearly, this was an issue in his day the threat of that distinction was being challenged, and I guess in our day as well.
It's possible that some Gnostic authors and some Gnostic leaders were getting light in the head. It's not clear what they were smoking when they were thinking this particular thought. And it's entirely possible that they were under the influence as they were producing some of their tremendous theories. But they were precisely believing that at heart of it, we're deity. And once we shed our embodiment, we will realize this fully. And I think Christianity, again, from Irenaeus on, has been quite clear that's a tempting thought, but it's also a thought that is, it's delusion.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm looking at your definition again here, and I'll bring it back up for folks to look at once more. And a question about the start and the conclusion of some of your comments here. So first of all, I did notice that in that opening statement, you, well, I don't want to say are hedging your bets, but there seems to be in that opening sentence, you're really trying to keep the door open here as much as possible. You know, the process and goal by which the human or the church or in some way all of creation. I like that. Keeping the options open there. But you also mention process. Now, as you can imagine with loving Irenaeus, I love the study of process and growth and progression. And so at the beginning you talk process, and then at the very end you write that deification made possible by the incarnation and sustained by the Spirit. So I'm trying to think of how that relates to process. And of course, you mentioned the sacramental life. Is the process limited to the sacramental life?
Father Andrew?
I would say that there's something about the Christian religion that necessitates baptism. We go back to the gospel. Jesus Christ says well, when you look especially at the end of Matthew's account of the gospel and Mark's account of the gospel, that everyone who believes and is baptized will be saved. Mark's account of the gospel or Matthew's account of the gospel, all power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And then he says, go baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So the beginning of the sacramental life is baptism. You can go to our Lord's with Nicodemus, you can go to St. Paul's letters, just again and again, baptism. So that the sacramental life begins with baptism and that there is a continuous life. So that we don't think that people are repeatedly baptized, that there's something about baptism that's the beginning of the sacramental life, and then the rest of life is precisely life after baptism. And then when you look at that definition, you see that the sacramental life then is the beginning of a list that continues prayer, ascetical discipline, growth and virtue. So for that the sacramental life is more than baptism, and we can think about other sacraments. So the Catholics and Orthodox will emphasize the sacraments, and then to think about the Holy Eucharist as prominent, as central. Dionysius calls the Eucharist the sacrament of sacraments, and then how this is about the entirety of life. So that, say, growth and virtue is precisely a way of living out, is the way of living out the deified life. You know, virtue in Greek means is arete, so excellence, and that we want to have the stable way of participating in God. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, partakers in the divine nature, where then we are able to grow in that process of living out.
Like also to just reaffirm the idea that deification is living out our Christian baptismal calling and baptismal grace. And what that also means is the grace of adoption as the children of God. And so this crucial notion, the deification language and the language of us being small c sons and small d daughters of God, that's a really significant point that we wanted. And there are several chapters, including Mark McEnroy's chapter on the Anglican theologians that track specifically the theme of adoption.
Now, I would like to ask a little bit about the larger vision for the handbook. Again, you mentioned a little bit what the purpose of these are, but it seems to me that some handbooks serve as, and you use this language in the introduction of it being encyclopedic, but some of them, are essentially summarizing where we're at, for example, with Athanasius on deification, but yours seems more ambitious than that. Talk to me about what this handbook really represents as a piece of scholarship.
So thank you. Our intention was twofold. On the one hand, we certainly wanted to give people a reliable reference guide to the state of the best scholarship and to simply take account of what we are calling deification studies and to some extent launch deification studies as a significant subfield within theology with this volume. So we certainly wanted to give people a reliable guide of what has been achieved in the past 100 years and even much longer, also taking a much longer perspective, obviously, on the matter. But then secondarily, we wanted to push the envelope significantly, and we wanted to discuss the writers that are typically not included in the story of deification. And those certainly would include a significant number of Western authors. And also, when it came to systematic questions, you will see, for example, that we talk about the metaphysics of deification. We talk about the application of deification to such topics as, for example, ecclesiology, anthropology, ecology, eschatology, and also ecumenical questions and interfaith questions. So the book is very generally ecumenical, and it certainly is also was meant by us as a major contribution to the dialogue between the East and the West by affirming that this is a shared tradition, as opposed to the tradition on which my Eastern Orthodoxy has some sort of exclusive copyright. So we certainly wanted to move from that misperception. Father Andrew?
Yes, absolutely. And then when you look at the design of the handbook, because it's in three parts, the first is cultural and scriptural roots, the second, soundings in the history of Christian theology, and the third, systematic connections. Within that second part about the soundings in the history of Christian theology, we have early, medieval, modern. We begin with the modern chapters of Martin Luther and the early Lutherans, John Calvin and the early Reformed theology. So that we want to make sure that we understand the breadth of deification theologies available, and then people can judge them on their own terms. That we ask scholars who are expert in these various areas to present. We're doing a handbook on deification. How do you see deification at work in these areas? And then we also wanted to have a critique. So we have a chapter on Karl Barth's critique of deification. So to make sure that we are cognizant that in the 20th century, there was a pushback to deification. And so then for people to have this all out, we have 44 chapters, and that people then can read the chapters that most interest them and then be surprised that the volume has lots of surprises for readers from whatever perspective they come to it and whatever level, whether they be relatively new to deification studies or actually experts, scholars in some area of deification. I know I've been surprised by the work that's been done by our team of scholars.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up surprise and you mentioned Luther and Calvin because, I don't have a studio audience here and I don't even have a co-host. And so you'll be thrilled to know that I'm using AI to be my co-host. You know, this is all the rage these days. You have to know about AI. And so I asked my AI friend, I said, what question would you ask for our esteemed professors? And so from our studio audience slash robot co-host, this question is posed to you both. Is it really possible that in the Oxford Handbook of Deification, that Martin Luther and John Calvin both get more than 12 pages each, but Irenaeus only gets 3? That's
What a fantastic question. Well, it's possible because we pulled it off. But a more rigorous and serious answer for your very enlightened AI interlocutor would be simply this. It's remarkable, by the way, that while, of course, there is a lot of work that Irenaeus has done on the concept of deification, the term theosis or theopoiesis does not, in fact, occur in Irenaeus. And in fact, we will have to wait for the word theosis. We would have to wait until Gregory Nazianzus, until the second part of the 4th century. So it's not, and so why give 12 pages to Luther and 12 pages to Calvin? Well, read a very, very important article specifically on this matter, both on Luther and the Mannerba school, and the really significance of that school of Finnish Lutheran studies in the past 30 years, and the retrieval of the theme of deification in Luther's works, especially in his sermons. And then, of course, we also have a brilliant, absolutely brilliant chapter by Karl Moser, who has done a significant work on the centrality of the theme for the authors of the Reformed tradition, and in particular, and let me just say, the way in which he frames this and approaches this. Let me just quote Moser's statement on page 503. This is what Moser writes. He says, Reformed theologians are interested in theosis primarily because it's biblical, patristic, and reformational. They're attempting to recover a patristic doctrine that has been part of their heritage since 1523, when Zwingli inscribed deification into the very first Reformed confession. Now, that's interesting, because deification does not show up in any of the ecumenical councils until we get to the Byzantine period. Now, just think about that. And yet you have in Zwingli's confession, we actually already have deification language, which means we're missing something in terms of the study of the Reformation history, was the overemphasis on justification and a relative neglect of the topic of deification. That said, of course, we do have significant monographic studies on Luther, Calvin, John Wesley, and other important lights of the Reformation, speaking to the variety of the topic, and at the same time, various elements that the reformers have been retrieving from the fathers. Father Andrew?
Yeah, so the surprises abound, and this will be one of the chief surprises, is the different kinds of deifications within Protestant theology. If I could take the surprise from a different direction and go back to Paul. So Paul contributed 2 chapters, and the first of the 2 chapters is on deification in Ukrainian and Russian thinking in the 19th century. And it's astounding to think about the 19th century with Paul's expertise. And Paul, would you please provide the summary of what kind of rich deification thinking did you find in the 19th century in Orthodox thinking in Russia and Ukraine?
Well, my principal discovery was that the topic itself, in many ways, was actually nearly forgotten in Russian and Ukrainian systematic theology. And that the manualist tradition, while it pays lip service to deification, very often simply replicates in a few lines, the fact that Christ's human nature was deified. And we would actually have to wait until the end of the 19th century, and more specifically until the beginning of the 20th century, where deification becomes what I call a magnet concept. And what I mean by that, it moves from the periphery of theological discourse to something central. And I attribute this, partially at least, to the reaction to the misappropriation of deification in the liberal Protestant thought. But in particular, I attribute that to Ritschl's critique of deification. So what Albert Ritschl was doing, he was reacting to the German idealist understanding of deification as almost pantheistic. And Ritschl was saying, no, Christian doctrine of salvation and reconciliation is a moral concept of reconciliation with God. And it has nothing to do with this quasi-medicinal process that is pantheistic. And so with Ritschl and Harnack, you have two grand misconceptions and misunderstandings of what deification was in the fathers. But what you have with Harnack, and what Harnack tracks, is the centrality of the topic. And that, with the exception of Dorner and with the exception of Matthias Schieben in the Catholic, particularly in the Catholic thought, that emphasis, that idea that deification is really central to theology and our account of God and our relationship with God, that in itself, I would say, was an interesting ecumenical gift. It's just that that ecumenical gift was reappropriated by Orthodox theologians, in particular by Ivan Popov. And we really have to wait until the first decade of the 20th century before we get anything like a focused monographic study of deification. Because our only other treatise, patristic treatise, that actually has explicitly deification in the title is Palamas's on divine and deifying energies. And before that treatise, we of course have significant patristic forays into the topic. What we don't have, and that's pretty shocking and astonishing, what we don't have is a focused study of it. And so the 19th century then becomes a process of a slow recovery of the concept. But it's only in the 20th century that both Orthodox and also French-speaking and other Catholic theologians, more or less together, approximately at the same time, begin a recovery of the topic. And this is, roughly speaking, in the period between the two world wars. And then also with ressourcement and neo-patristic synthesis and neo-patristic theology, then later in the post-Second World War period. So this is just in very, very, very rough lines.
Excellent, thank you.
Perhaps another surprise, another quick surprise is that while in Vladimir Solovyov, and then in particular in Vladimir Solovyov, deification language and deification terminology is not prominent, one could certainly say that the conception of making Sophia the wisdom of God and understanding Sophia along the lines of divine humanity, or this connection between divine and human rendered into a metaphysical principle, that was also an important step. But what's important here is you have an Orthodox philosopher and theologian making that move with much help, especially from Jacob Boehme, Schelling, and others. So again, coming back to our idea of surprises, what you have is this remarkable zigzagging of appropriations and misappropriations of deification in East and West that culminates in the 20th century with a much fuller recovery of the topic. That said, I don't think we should be too optimistic about how fully recovered the topic is, because within, if you will, the circles of the scholars that study deification, we might come up with a mistaken view that somehow deification is universally received. But I think the minute you speak to much broader theological audience, you discover that no, that deification is still met with a considerable amount of resistance. And we certainly did not want to ignore that. Father Andrew?
Yes, so I think that's absolutely right. With the surprises, sometimes when I was reading about deification years ago, I would see that it needed to be put within the framework of Gregory Palamos's particular theology of deification. And so then that you would have this word from Greg of Nazianzus, theosis, and then the essence energies distinction. And I'd like for us to consider thesis number 20. So our introduction has 25 theses. And number 20, I think, is an eye-opener concerning the Eastern Orthodox contributions. So in Byzantine Orthodox theology, the ontological difference between the creator and creatures in deification is captured by means of the essence energies distinction associated with the theological legacy of Gregory Palamos. According to Palamos, deified humans participate in the uncreated divine energies, but not in the divine essence. Thus, creatures participate in God without becoming identical with the divine essence. Some elements of Palamos's legacy are applicable to earlier patristic treatments of deification, while other elements are not. Some contemporary theologians take the fully developed Orthodox Christian doctrine of deification to be normatively defined by the essence energies distinction. The advantage of this approach is that it gives greater clarity and distinctiveness to the understanding of deification in Orthodox theology. This approach is of lesser heuristic value for the discussion of pre-Palamite accounts of deification, in which the essence energies distinction does not feature significantly. The examples of such accounts include Athanasius of Alexandria, Cyril of Alexandria, Simeon the New Theologian, and many others. That there is a variety found within the Eastern Christian tradition, and that there is a claim to Gregory Palamos as giving a particular value or set, and fine. But we just need to recognize that there is a greater variety within the theological expression. And then as a Westerner approaching this, to be able to see how, well, there are varieties in the theology found in different places and different times.
Okay.
I couldn't agree more. Yes.
Wonderful. We've been talking about surprises, and I wonder, maybe perhaps you've answered this, but of all the chapters, which one might you say exceeded your expectations the most? And maybe not because of surprising insights, but perhaps the depth of which it interacted with themes you were not aware it was going to touch on, or just a fabulous piece of scholarship. That is there one chapter that really jumps out in that regard?
I mean, I would want myself to somewhat resist the temptation of just highlighting one chapter at the expense of others. And so from the very beginning, and I would certainly attribute this to the genius of my co-editors, both Father Andrew and Matthew Levering, that they really insisted that the quality that we absolutely have to exercise quality controls when it comes to the contributors. The quality of the contributors would ultimately result in a quality handbook. And I think overall, we have been just incredibly pleased with the quality. Some systematics chapters might be a bit more experimental because there isn't simply much context for writing about these topics, and they really are venturing into some new, entirely new areas. For me, what would be the sort of the chapters that stand out and the strongest? Take a look at Maximus Constas's, for example, chapter on Maximus the Confessor. And the reason it's important is because he's unpacking. So in Maximus, deification is a concept of structural significance. And what I mean by that, it really is correlated with his account of the cosmos, with his account of creation, redemption, and the eschaton. And so within Maximus, you have these two arches, if you will, the smaller arch from running from sin to redemption, and the larger arc from creation to deification. That's in the words of Andrew Love. And what's particularly precious to me in that chapter is also the unpacking of the quantum tantum motif in Maximus, and that's this bold notion that Maximus proposes, that to the extent to which God became man, it's then possible then for humanity to become God. And so, in what sense is that true or not? You might want to also cast this in terms of what's the logic of the so-called exchange formula. God became man so that humans could become God. We find versions of that formula, arguably already the roots of it are, of course, in Paul, but arguably we find the earliest versions of it in Irenaeus, and then subsequently, of course, in later authors. And then, so the question is, what precisely is at stake, soteriologically, metaphysically, anthropologically, in the formula itself? Let me just stop there. Father Andrew?
I love all the chapters. I am so grateful to God for the gift of the work of the contributors. And it really is astounding when you read this together as the handbook. And so I want to single out one chapter as an example, but it's not necessarily my favorite chapter, but I just want this to be emphasized. And that is chapter 31 by Mike Habits on recent Anglican and Protestant theology. So with the example that Paul gave about Father Maximus Constance's treatment of St. Maximus the Confessor, you have one theologian. The whole chapter is on one theologian, extremely important in deification theology, as recognized by East and West today. So St. Maximus's emphasis or contribution has been increasingly recognized over the past 80 years. And that people say, yes, Maximus, that's great, and it's a wonderful chapter. Excellent, excellent. Well, with this one, this gets into more controversial topics. So recent Anglican and Protestant theology. And Habits, in one chapter, reviews Lutheran theology, Reformed theology, Anglican theology, Wesleyan Methodist theology, Pentecostal charismatic theology, Baptist theology, Anabaptist theology. All right, so he then, within his chapter, covers a huge range of various kinds of Anglican and Protestant theologies, and to be able to see this is how they contribute to deification studies. And I think it's a marvelous achievement. It's very, very handy for the handbook.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't agree more. I was really excited about Mike's contribution, and he's a Baptist theologian. I think residing, if I'm not mistaken, in remind me, is it
New Zealand?
New Zealand. It's New Zealand, actually. It's New Zealand, and we sort of owe this chapter partly to my encounter with him on an escalator as we were running probably to different sessions at one of the at the American Academy of Religions conferences, annual conferences, and then made the connection. But our team of editors has really been just working so well together, and I think that's really key. Our triad, its actions ad extra, were very united. As united as human actions can possibly be. So we were trying to imitate Trinitarian activity.
Oh, I love it. Very good. Shifting from surprises, what might each of you say has been revealed as the area of greatest need for further research?
I would say that one element is, if we've been trying to unpack the ecumenical implications of deification for a while, I would like to see what does that mean concretely, in fact, for the union of the churches. And the reason that's relevant is because what are we ultimately discussing? We're discussing the manner of our union with God. And to the extent to which we humans are united to God, ultimately, eschatologically then, in the communion of saints, we're united to each other. So there is that kind of patterning. So the kind of the movement closer to Christ and the movement closer to God ultimately should also bring us together. What I have not yet seen, I mean, I've seen a lot of kind of dancing around the topic, and that partly maybe has to do in the ecumenical conversations, but was failure at this point to articulate anything like, for example, the joint statement on justification that the Catholic and the Lutheran churches have put out. There is no joint statement on deification, for example, but that would not be unimportant and uninteresting. I think that the surprises around the 19th century and the long 19th century and how that's important for the recovery of deification and why and how we study deification then in the earlier sources today, that's of interest. That's of interest to me. But I think if you look at just about any topic in the systematic section, you will find that most of those chapters are open textured, meaning inviting further reflection and inviting further conversation. Certainly, be it eschatology, be it ecclesiology, be it theological anthropology, or other topics. There is, of course, also a really absolutely beautiful chapter on the Trinitarian framework for deification by Gilles Emery, a Swiss-French, of course, Dominican theologian.
Don, my first thought was also ecumenical, and how in our acknowledgments, the editors have, we have been deeply gratified and inspired by the abiding presence of Christian ecumenical friendship and fellowship during the preparation of this handbook. May the finished volume, the product of so much work by our esteemed and eminent contributors, be a blessing that opens our minds and hearts ever more fully to the deifying grace of the Holy Spirit in Christ Jesus. And may it also stimulate bonds between separated Christians and between Christians and non-Christians that serve the love, mercy, and reconciliation that God wills to bring about. So when Paul says, you know, the Catholic Church and the Lutherans got together to have this declaration on justification, and that was a great achievement in various respects. There's nothing comparable about deification. Can the Christian communities come together and, with the help of things like this handbook, sit down on high-level ecumenical dialogues, and then to be able to assist the leaders of the church to be able to say, you know, this is about salvation, and we just need to state this clearly. This is our end, you know, and this is the process to that end or goal. And then to be able to see what actually will give, and then what needs to be affirmed by the different kinds of ecumenical communities. So the Finnish Lutheran dialogue, the Finnish Lutheran Orthodox dialogue was very important in an early phase of this. But I think this opens up many different kinds of connections that can be done to bring Christians more closely together in Christ.
What obstacles are there? I mean, if we think about history, the creed, doctrine of the Trinity to somewhat, we know some of those sticking points that cause some tension. Is there a sticking point, one or two keys in this doctrine that really causes there to be a challenge in trying to bring everyone to the table and in agreement?
Well, one thing about to the table would be to the table that is the altar of the Lord and the question of the Eucharist. So what is the Eucharist? What is the Eucharist for? And that we need to recognize that various Christians have different responses to the Eucharist. And so that so again, Daniel Keating's chapter would be one form of this, but there are other chapters too that deal with the question of the Eucharist, and so the significance of the Eucharist for the life of deification.
Yes, in this regard, I would particularly recommend Father Andrew's chapter on Cyril of Alexandria, because it is in Cyril that we have a repeated insistence on the fact, and in his Christology also, we have the very heart of the justification for why the partaking of the body and blood of Christ is also a vehicle of deification. And so there's certainly been And Father Andrew, of course, relies on also a body of scholarly work arguing for how significant that theme is for Cyril. What is the sticking point? I think very often in the public context, we are asked a question, can we get by with other terms? Why do we want to use this very strange and surprising term that seems to imply that we become the fourth person of the Trinity? And first and foremost, of course, we want to, again, explain the teaching of deification in such a way that it doesn't develop into this absurd concept that we become simply or are realizing that we're gods by essence. So we're clearly not, so deification needs to be clearly explained. But this is where, again, I find also Karl Moser's work so inspiring and so important, because he really bites the bullet and says, okay, you can get by with other terms, but the reality is then you would be missing something in the Christian account of salvation. You would really be missing the mark, because you will end up then talking about salvation as being rescued from the fiery furnaces of hell, or you would be thinking of salvation exclusively also in terms of justification, and simply the kind of the ultimate escape from and avoidance of the divine wrath. And there's a richer and more important language of participation in Christ, becoming one in Christ, letting Christ live in us. So there is a language of Christification, language of adoption and sanctification, and that language converges on the concept of deification. There's a way in which deification attracts these notions to itself and really offers a vision that hopefully all Christians could embrace, including contemporary charismatic Pentecostal and evangelical Christians. And of course, these are the forms of Christianity that are growing rapidly as we speak today, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. And I think that if we were to bring, if you will, that the elements of this tradition to them, I think they would find it very congenial, or could find it very congenial.
Very good. Now, I've noticed, speaking of terminology and its importance, Father Andrew, you have published elsewhere using the term divinization. And any comment on that? And I did not even see that appear in the introduction. Just a quick comment on that, if you could.
So there are various words that can be used to describe the same mystery. And so deification, because of the Latin deificatio, conveys more of the making. So the making of to be God. So whereas divinization is more about a process. But really, there are several words that can be used. Several words in the Greek tradition, several words in the Latin tradition, so all the different traditions, several words in English, and I'm just fine with the multiplicity of words. The question is, what do you actually mean? And so in some sense, to be able to help us think about meaning, we kind of kept the same word, and then to be able to have the word then used in different contexts to strive after more meaning.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, ultimately, meaning is use. And yes, we simply strove for consistency. And just as it is the case in Greek and in Latin, there is also a slight variation between обожение and обожествление in Slavic and languages, and specifically in Russian. And the second term, обожествление, just as divinization, is sometimes used in the context of apotheosis of the Roman emperors, etc. But that said, there is a kind of a terminological slippage very often found there. And so that was partially, at least, why we preferred deification. I think it's also just a matter of what's more consistently used in contemporary theology. And I think in contemporary theology, the most consistent use is for the term theosis and for the term deification. We did not wish to insist on theosis because that might inadvertently exclude theopoiesis and other significant Greek terms. Also, we did not, I think when one uses exclusively the Greek term, that might create a mistaken impression that therefore, again, this is a doctrine that is conceived and patented in the Greek patristic and Byzantine theology, and that therefore Latin theology and, broadly speaking, Western theology and Syriac theology have very little to say on the subject. And we wanted, of course, to move as far away from that position as possible, so that deification is no longer some kind of archaic view, an exotic view of the Orientals and Oriental Christians broadly, but rather it's really something that could be, that all Christians could live out. And that is also a treasure within our joint tradition, East and West.
Right. Last question from me. Again, speaking of this living out, to some extent, what really drew me to Irenaeus initially, I think, was his statement to the effect of that we will be progressing eternally in this process of coming to know of the Creator. And so again, though he doesn't use the language of deification, he gives this vision of eternal progress. And I'm curious how many others use language to that effect, that this process itself is eternal. Is that common, or are there more that would speak of an end, culminating fulfillment that does occur at some point?
There is a variety of expression. So St. Gregor of Nyssa is especially studied today for that sense of the ongoing process, whereas St. Augustine and then St. Thomas following St. Augustine has more of that sense of the perfect completion. But sometimes people think, well, that sounds boring. But within this Western emphasis on that perfect completion, that it is not a matter of boring, okay, because God himself is pure act. He doesn't grow. That there's something about our completion in heaven that is beautiful and unending in bliss. So I think what should be emphasized is that both depictions are about heaven and that there is nothing really lacking. But there is a tradition that you find, especially among various Greek fathers, that continues and that is being studied today about an ongoing process in heaven of continuing to follow. Paul, what would you like to say?
Oh, Father Andrew, I love everything that you said. Well, consider the process of putting together a handbook. Now, the process itself could be very enjoyable, but if there is no completion of the process, if the process becomes infinite, and Don, I have to warn you that the process can become infinite because of how much there is involved, then in a sense, there is no final perfection resulting in the publication and then hopefully in the eschatological mailing of the copies by Oxford University Press, which is not always responsive to our pleas for sending such copies. And so it's important. Progress is beautiful, but I think one has to progress towards a goal. And the non-achievement of the goal could result in what Hegel called bad infinity. And this is, in this case, to oppose this to, I suppose, a good kind of infinity, where, in a sense, there's a tangible sense of peace, quietus, and perfection, and rest in God. And so I suppose as an Easterner, I'm supposed to back the process part. But Alexis Torrance and a few others have told us that this is also a very limited reading of the Greek Christian sources, and that they are really intent on, especially Maximus, is intent on articulating and emphasizing that while, yes, for creatures to be immobile in a sense means regress, ultimately, at the ultimate perfection, there also needs to be a completion and rest in God. And so what I guess what I'm trying to say is that the description of our eschatological state is bound to remain somewhat paradoxical. In other words, a perfection and a completion, and yet a completion not indicating boredom precisely, but actually indicating the fact that there is an inexhaustible mystery that God is, and that life itself really cannot be in any way ultimately participated in anything other than an infinite joy and peace in the unity with God.
Very good. Well, and to that end, speaking of completion, I'm getting begged by my co-host to ask you along those lines that if an Orthodox, Dominican, and Protestant are together in the pub discussing deification, who finally ends up paying the bill? I don't know. I don't think it's the Protestant, I'll tell you. I don't
Depends
think
how
we
much
get around to it.
Depends how much we drink, but we owe this volume to Father Andrew's hospitality, and actually he's providing the drinks for our initial meeting in Washington, D.C. So there you have it. There
That's
you
true.
have it. There you have it.
Very
There
good.
you have it. The Dominicans were paid. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay. I'll hold you to that, Father Andrew.
Okay.
Thank you both so much for this afternoon, but most especially for I've only just started, but not only a beautiful, but really, really interesting volume that so far looks just fantastic. Thank you for that, for your hard work, and Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much, Don. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you too.